football who can compete realistically with other clubs. Unless we take this chance, we're going to, at best, I think, be a League Two club that occasionally gets to League One, might even risk going to the National League and what that would bring. If we take this chance and take this big step, there's no reason why we can't aspire to be in the championships. You know I've got concerns about the ownership of the stadium and the idea of a pitch owners club. You've told me that a pitch owners club isn't necessary. You've never told us why we can't have one. I'll relieve you now and say I don't expect it. What I'd be interested to know is you're obviously talking to a lot of investors. Just be interested to know who of your committee has actually spoken to and met these potential investors, and what the process is at the club to actually meet and discuss it with them. Who is it they first approach? And finally, the last question is, what do you value the club at today in your negotiations with potential investors? Because you have a figure, and it would help us to know what your might be selling up to 25% of our club at.
Thank you, Peter. Those are three very good questions. I'm going to take the easy one, which is about James Tilley. And I think, just to say, I think he's put in a fantastic shift since he's come back to us, and he's come home in a way. He talks about how he's slotted straight back into our team, and he felt that he belonged back here. I hear that. Yeah, it's always a shame when a footballer chooses another direction, or someone else in an organisation involved with a footballer chooses another direction for a particular player. But in professional football, that's something that happens. That said, he's back. He's doing a great job for us, and I hope he returns. But I'll pass on to the other two questions in a sec. But we're also being very careful to say we're not just going to take an investment and spend all of it on player wages. That's not the plan.
I'll try and answer as best I can a bit about the process of investors coming in. We get numerous approaches. Frequently their starting point maybe somebody they know. I think the most common one is they go to Mick because he's chair, and then it gets filtered from there. In terms of the actual formal process at the moment, the person with responsibility to represent the club board and all those matters is Michelle, just on a day-to-day of pulling everything together, pulling all the paperwork together. There's loads goes on in the background, which of course just hits a dead end, which is very frustrating, but it is necessary. So we don't want the whole board, both boards taken up with that. The person who represents the Don's Trust in that process, filling the same role as Michelle fills, is myself. Yes, we've had lots of approaches. We've had quite a few NDAs go out as well, so that people can see into our data room. Generally, the process would be, we'll have an initial meeting with a core group. So yet again, it's not both boards. It's only when we get further down the line that any potential investor would get to meet both boards and be presented to both boards, or if there is a particular point that they are focused upon which requires the knowledge and indeed consent of both boards to take things forward further. But in general, the day-to-day, to get them to a certain point, it's a small group of people with a couple of very good volunteers, and also a consultant that we've had on the payroll for a period of time whilst this has been built. I mentioned the philosophical alignment and how we take that. So there's a whole piece of work been going on about effectively guidelines and scorecards. There's been a whole build out in the background going on. I mentioned the data room. That's not something you can build in 5 seconds. So all that work has been ongoing. So we are at a point now where things should effectively roll through rather than just reacting to somebody turning up. As Mick and Michelle have mentioned before, and I've said, we've had lots of approaches. Some of them can be discounted immediately, some of them we can discount quite quickly, but that still takes some time. So that's where the process is, and the idea is right at the end of that process, the Dons Trust Board are able to make a recommendation of somebody who we believe, I go back to Alex, it's a bit like buying a house. It's very rare that you have 10 things that you want in a house and all 10 are there, but you want to get as close to that 10 as possible. So if we can get 8 or 9, that's great. And if we can't get there, then we'll have to keep looking. But ideally, we'd find someone because we can't afford to look forever. And then what was the third bit? Sorry, there was another bit.
I was asking how many of you have spoken to potential investors?
At various stages, everybody on both boards has seen somebody. But not necessarily. It depends where that particular group has got to in the process, or if there's a particular issue. But for all board members at some point have spoken to people who've been on the list.
And how much do you value our club at?
So this is where I'll probably get, where's Michelle? She'll probably tell me that I've got the numbers wrong. On a basis of before the equity goes in, so taking account of our debt and all the rest of it, values us at 28.8 million. You know, if we, depending on the type of share we issue, so you could actually go up to 34.72 because of the way our voting is separated from the ownership. The assumption is that we would be issuing new shares, and therefore that the share price on issuance would be at what it is at the moment, which is 83 pence a share.
I've heard the figure that has been mentioned of 60 million.
You could argue that something's only worth what somebody's prepared to pay for it.
I mean, it is our club. Could you not
Here you go, Peter.
be a little... It is our club. Could you not give us a figure? You obviously know one because you're negotiating with potential investors.
It's not 60.
It's not?
It's not 60.
Well, what is it? Why the reluctance? It's our club.
Because it's part of negotiation.
I think Graham's given you the share price number and a kind of a valuation number. The reality is, as Graham says, the shares are only worth what someone, you know, anything is only worth what someone will pay for it. If this vote passes and the next vote passes and we bring an investor, then we can talk about, you know, kind of in great detail, as much detail as humanly possible about what those numbers are, like we've said already. Graham's given you some pretty solid numbers, I think, and, you know, kind of I think that's where we are.
Thank you.
Sorry. Are different for minority shareholders or significant minority shareholders or selling the whole thing. The highest value, and your number may not be a million miles away from that, give or take the odd few million, is different if we're selling the whole thing. We are not selling the whole thing, and I can't speak for every director, but I certainly have no intention of being involved in selling the whole club.
Finally, if this does happen and this vote passes, and I hope it will, I take Angus's point about it won't all go and player wages. I don't expect it to, but I hope some will, so that if we take this big step, next season, people like Craig and others will be in a position to compete on an equal footing.
Part of what we have right at the moment is a very enviable position in League One right now, and a position that is far in excess of our current player budget. So that's a factor in our discussions with these investors, because that's something they wish to keep. Next question, please.
Hi, Stuart Deacons. I'd like to echo what Roger said earlier about the story, the journey, because my major concern is that if this does pass, we will get through tonight, April, and then we go through to the summer, where everyone naturally has a wind down, and then we come back to this. I'm not too sure what the timelines are here, but I think the last thing we want to do is get to where the investor comes up and the journey hasn't been continued, just appear on that. I've got concerns majorly about timelines. So, you know, if you look at the Sheffield Wednesday situation, there's somebody paying £4 million and then dropped out because the fit and proper person test, they probably were going to fail it. So my question really is, what processes we got in place to make sure before we go to the fit and proper person test that they will pass? When will that go to the independent financial regulator? So when do they sign on the dotted line? So is it they sign on the dotted line, then they go to the fit and proper person test? Because the further we kick this down the road, obviously we're getting more closer to when potentially our money could run out.
Thanks, Stuart. It's a good question, and you know, any investor would have to pass the owners and directors test. So that's a given. They need to understand that before they get involved with buying a share in a football club, because I think the term is a controlling interest. You have a controlling interest, just as we all do as members of the Dons Trust Board, and therefore you have to be able to pass that particular test. So there isn't a way past that. And in fact, the independent football regulator is working on strengthening that test right now. Any more to add? Did I answer your question?
So yeah, it was also the timelines. So do they sign on a dotted line, then we go to the director test, or what's that look like?
There's different levels. We do what I'd call a pre-check. There's 2 levels of due diligence done on everybody who gets to a certain stage. I don't really want to say all that I can about that, but yes, we do check quite carefully. The owners and directors test will apply to anybody who is obviously going to be on the board or is acting in concert. So they are made aware of that, and that process would start before finally signing. The process with the league alone is usually 6 weeks. I take your point about timelines. We can't afford to wait for everything to be done to then start that process because it is slow.
Thanks, Stuart. Any more questions from people? Lauren at the back there, Martin.
Good evening, Laurent Guibaud. No one's mentioned the annual trading deficit, and I worry about it because it's the one thing that can bankrupt us soon, regardless of whether we have an investor. What are the Trust's concrete plans to reduce the annual trading deficit to 0?
That's for you, I think.
If we come back to, I fully take your point, yeah. The easiest way to lose the club is to run out of money. As James has said, that's always been the biggest risk. In terms of getting an investor in for equity, and this comes back to your point as well, Terry, it is about not just putting all the money on the playing budget, which is the equivalent of lumping all on the 2-1 favourite and the 5.30 in some instances. It is also about widening our foundations, which is where our capital expenditure comes in, but also giving us opportunity to grow our revenues. So some of that is, could well be headcount within our commercial marketing activities as well. So there are numerous ways in which we can move towards that. To investors, we have laid out our strategy over 5 years. There are lots of assumptions about when the money comes in on those. But we have laid out a 5-year strategy as to what we would describe as our baseline case to get us towards reliable sustainability. So far the people that we've talked to on a serious level have accepted our baseline case. There's a lot of work gone into that. we need to execute it successfully. If we execute it successfully, and with a few other things that James has alluded to as well, coming in within that period, we will reach that reliable sustainability that we look for. So football fortune would end up being the icing on the cake, not a great big part of the cake.
Can you tell us about that strategy so we can draw our own opinions of whether it's workable or not?
I'd love to be able to do that. It is dependent, highly dependent on how any investor views it or looks at the prioritisation of it. So whilst we know there will be increase in headcount, there will be some uplift in playing budget, you've got to take account of the people putting the money in as to whether they agree with our prioritisation. They may well agree with all of the aims, they may not necessarily agree with the order in which things are done. And that's part of a negotiation. So unfortunately, no. If we share anything above headlines, it's most likely that it will be incorrect. And that's not the right thing to do.
Thanks, Graham.
Can I just say one thing on the owners and directors test? Along with a lot of people here, I don't think I have much faith in it because we've seen how it's failed over the last 20, 30 years. I would say all the people in this room are probably the best owners and directors test we could ever have, because we've got more experience here and people who aren't here are still probably watching. So I would say when it comes to putting this proposal to us, we're the ones who should be doing that, and not rely on the FA or the Football League.
That's a good point. Well made, Martin. Thank you. Any more questions from the floor?
Roger Hopkinson again. Less questions, more suggestions. Peter's point about the pitch owners one, I think, is a topic you should be tackling head on because of our friends or neighbours up the district line who have had that for 20, 30 years or so. I suspect that's what more supporters would ask about. What is our safety now? I understand it. I've had a chat with Danny Norris who explained why it might not be appropriate for us. I think that's something you could do well to articulate why it's not appropriate for us. The second point, trying to be sensitive, I discussed it with my sister, who was a very successful sportswoman, is our women's side and the cost of that. It's the right thing to do, but what's that in our story going forward? Are we investing it full on?